don't even remember exactly how I would check on this. Should come through right here. Oh, now it looks like we're live. Oh, we're live. Okay, here we go. All right, Chad the alcoholic comes in today at 4:07 a.m. and 5:12 a.m. That's perhaps Pacific time. So, two questions right out of the gate. Are they questions or are they comments? Well, let's see. In my opinion, here in this little corner of the internet, we explore lots about process and what almost seems like action related to intentional telos. I would like to hear your thoughts on something like grace revelation, something like suddenly seeing something that simply wasn't there before, but now is, and now is the most important thing to be seen. Perhaps something like metanoia or Saul having a sudden change into Paul. Well, it's transformations. And, Chad, you of many people, there are a fair number of people who are in recovery in this little corner of the internet. And just going through the transformation of recovery, going from moving into sobriety, that suddenly what was the world looks different now. You see the world through different eyes. You see yourself through different eyes. Sometimes, again, we call that grace. Sometimes it's revelation. But once you attain sobriety, you see the world through sober eyes, and you also begin to understand why you weren't sober. Again, my friend who slept against my door for many years, some days he would say, "Oh, it was horrible this morning. I woke up sober." And what he meant by that was he had to face a lot of the destruction in his life, and it's part of the reason he wasn't sober. So, yeah, we look for transformations, and there's this word in Greek, palingenesia, which is sort of the renewal of all things. And that's really what I anticipate in the work of Jesus Christ as it, behold, I make all things new, he says in the book of Revelation. So yeah, that's what we're leaning towards. That's what we're looking forward to and looking towards. Second point, I'm putting this down so I don't forget. You can come back to it later if you like. I was listening to Jacob's Just Chatting stream yesterday, and a fiction story came to my mind, a dark comedy, something like the Coen Brothers movie, where there's a huge internet marketing firm operating in the United States who specializes in selling diapers, pizza, kids' juice boxes, and vodka. What starts to develop is a conversation around the water cooler where a bet emerges that somebody could actually sway people's opinion and viewpoints. So an office pool starts where everyone buys in for $20, and in their own off time, they begin the battle, which elevates into something like civil war. Will someone please write this? Well, Chad's, a lot of people don't appreciate just how creative Chad is. And Jacob was sharing yesterday in his Just Chat a particular theory about Paul and the launch of Christianity, et cetera, et cetera. And Sam and I said, well, if that conspiracy story is true, then it's the greatest hoax that has ever been perpetrated on the world. And, the Apostle Paul says something almost identical to it. If Christ doesn't raised from the dead, then all of this stuff is just a really cruel joke on humanity, because we've all been given false hope of the renewal of ourselves and the renewal of all things. And if it isn't true, if it's a big hoax or a big lie or a big misunderstanding, it's a far sadder world. So, yeah, interesting idea, Chad. Eric Young. Hey, Paul. Thanks for doing these Q&As again. They're always fantastic. I've been thinking a lot about the human imagination and how even modern people have a hard time explaining in materialist terms. Even neuroscience has little to tell us about how the imagination works or evolves. I think this might be a good way to start introducing the ideas about spirits and the hierarchy of attention from this little corner of the internet to the general population. Could you share any insights you might have about this idea? Could you talk about the imagination in a good way to start breaking down the materialist frame, or or does that argument lead somewhere flawed? Thank you. When Peterson and Sam Harris were talking in Vancouver 1, Peterson made the point, you sit on the side of your bed and, in a sense, the world talks back at you. When I talked to Christian Golden, when you look into the abyss starts speaking back at you. And both Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson could agree that where this stuff comes from, we don't know. I was sitting in my living room last night thinking about this idea, and that's right. Thoughts emerge, things pop up, and where they come from, well, in a sense, that's what the ancients sort of storied about, had narratives about. And someone might say, well, they come from your head. Well, that's an awfully low resolution answer. um, Maybe but I'm not even exactly sure what my head is, because if you say, well, that's that physical thing on the top of your shoulders, yeah, but my head seems to be able to span time and space via my imagination in ways that this oblong thing on top of my head that seems to grow fuzz on the bottom doesn't really do physically. So yeah, there have been, as noted for those who have been watching the most recent videos, and especially when the next two Randos conversations come out, there's a lot of talk about, okay, we've been yakking it up for 4 years now. Maybe it's time to get organized and have a little bit more disciplined presentation about what we're doing and what this is about, to the degree at least that we can know it and understand it ourselves. And so imagination isn't a bad place to start. I think what we'll actually have is a lot of different on-ramps, because one of the things that you learn as a preacher is that you always engage your audience where they're at, because that's how you engage a human being. If you're talking to a little child, especially a little boy, sometimes they're all over the map. Sometimes you'll just gently take their head in your hand to make eye contact and say, okay, well, now we see each other. Now we can begin. And so we always engage people where they're at, not where they'd like to be, not where they should be, but where they're at right now. And in the Bible, God does that. God condescends to our situation and meets us where we're at. And so it might be imagination. It might be the combinatorial explosiveness of reality, which we've learned by trying to make robots. A lot of different on ramps for this. But part of the challenge is that, well, not really the challenge, but part of the advantage is that all of you, things get shared by people who have found value in them and are excited about them and want to let their friends in on a good thing. And now, it's not always good things friends let friends in on, but that's really how these kinds of things grow. To the degree that this will grow or should grow, that's, in my opinion, that's for God to decide. And it's always God's timing. So, and just before we started, we joked about, because Mark was talking about Jacob and some of the recent Just Chatting videos that I've pulled into some of my recent videos, and we'll see how well Jacob can resist jumping in the room here with his own self-imposed exile from the Bridges of Meaning Discord. So we'll see what goes. So thanks, Eric. La Fourchette. What are the main shortcomings you perceive or understand or suspect John Vervaeke has? Well, I think your question is your question is well formed, because are you asking about him as a person, or are you asking about some of the ideas that he's presenting? And I'm more than happy to talk and to critique and work on his ideas. That's the kind of dialogos that we've been doing together. But as a person, people are, because they're in the image of God at one level or another sacred. And, especially now that I've had a chance to meet John in person and spend at least a little time together. I'd love to spend more time together one-on-one with John, but we had a lovely time together. And John is a lovely human being, and to see him in person and to be with him around.
Yeah, I got you. Hey.
Somebody's not muted. To spend some time with him as a person. He is a lovely human being. He's generous and gracious, and so, and I've critiqued his work, and I'll continue to critique his work, and he'll continue to critique my ideas. And that's the purpose of this. And a big part of the purpose of this is that we have different ideas and different approaches, but we engage productively with each other. That's kind of the whole point of all this. One of the videos that I've wanted to do for a while is a little bit of commentary on his appearance on Lex Fridman. And there was a ton of stuff. I thought that was one of his best interviews, and I haven't gotten into it because I'm a little bit ADHD, and I also often new things come around, and I'm sort of a sucker for a lot of the new things, but sometimes I'll swing back and hit some of the old things. But if you do, I would rather leave it wide a lot. But if you want to narrow down the scope of the question, the optional route, where does your understanding of John 1 sit with his understanding? Now, logos, I think that's probably what you're talking about. There's a lot of, whether or not John and Jordan and Jonathan and I sort of all have the same understanding of logos, I don't know. But that ambiguity, I think, was also present for the readers of the prologue of the Gospel of John, because that word was broadly used in a variety of philosophical and religious traditions when John employed it in the prologue. And that ambiguity isn't necessarily a bad thing, for the reason I talked about before, that God condescends and engages us where we're at. And so, I think, in terms of, I'd love, there's a whole bunch of avenues that, I'll continue, John and I will continue to pursue with each other. Sam and John and I have talked about doing another conversation on telos in evolution. Sam's been sort of pursuing that angle. I'd love to hear more follow-up from Jonathan Peugeot on the idea that he and John began to pursue at Thunder Bay about this question. There's sort of a physicalist, emergentist assumption that much of what we're doing sort of is dependent on humans. And this got brought up in one of the very early biblical series, when someone asked Jordan Peterson basically if all the humans were to be eradicated from the universe, would these archetypes that Jordan talks about, would they disappear? In other words, are these archetypes emergent from human beings? And so then when we talk about the spirit world, the Bible seems to assume that a spirit world in some ways predates. This stuff is just so hard to talk about. That we participate in some spirits. Certainly we generate some spirits, but there are spirits that are not dependent on us. And I think that is basic creation 101 in Christianity, because as the Epistle of John notes, God is spirit, and we are created by the Spirit of God. But now Jonathan Pajot's idea about the role of the Son of Man in that creation, especially with respect to Colossians 1, is a very interesting one. So there's a lot there that's sort of fun to play around with. And I just feel tremendously gratified that we have a conversation partner in this corner of the internet like John Vervaeke, because he brings so much. And while certainly I'd love to see him personally become a Christian, him as a non-theist and as a non-Christian really helps the conversation and keeps some of us Christians honest about some things by challenging us. A bunch of the comments on the videos that I've made about conflict on the internet, like the one I released this morning, talked about opponent processing, and I think that's right. And in a good, in a healthy little community that is getting at the truth, sort of embodying this opponent processing is really key. So inside of me, there's a consciousness Congress that seems to manifest itself through what I talk. Now, with, let's say, when Jonathan and I get together and have conversation, we sort of become another body, and there's a lot of opponent processing in there. And part of what makes it fun is that there are differences. And so John is going to challenge ideas that we bring forward, and we're going to challenge ideas he brings forward. And John, I think, has been a very fair partner in this. Now, that doesn't mean he's right about everything. None of us are right about everything. That's what it means to be human, especially from a Calvinist perspective. But I've really valued John's participation in this right from the start. Can you tackle the logos theme more generally? Again, I prefer you would give one insight without any given direction. I'm not quite sure what that means. Again, what are his shortcomings? It's not. What are some of the shortcomings of his theory? I don't think. I don't think you can sort of come up with a religion ex nihilo. I'm not going to say that that's exactly what he's doing, because he is trying to gather an ecology of practices to address the meaning crisis. But even Christianity builds on everything that God had worked through the Hebrew people and the Israelite people. So God doesn't seem to just sort of start it as new, but builds on it. And in fact, what you see in the history of religion is that Buddhism in many ways comes out of this very dynamic group of religious ideas that developed on the Indian subcontinent. C.S. Lewis writes about this. Islam builds on, I think I suspect Tom Holland has a point in his book, The Shadow of the Sword, in terms of sort of where the space, this fringe space, sort of outside Judaism and Christianity in the 6th century and 7th century, where Islam sort of emerges. Mormonism emerges from the burned over district in upstate New York, as do a bunch of other things. That's just sort of the dynamic nature of religion, that they build on other things. And so all of the attempts to build religion from science, I think, tends to fail. I made a comment on Twitter this morning that I thought Jonathan Pajot's conversation with Aubrey Marcus was Jonathan's biggest YouTube challenge yet, because new atheism is never going to be a contender. Now, someone said, well, what about atheism in Europe? I said, yeah, okay. But I meant new atheism. I think a lot of atheism in the West continues to sort of work from the Christian playbook and try to cut out the what is described by secularism as religious. But again, that is, some people have called it sort of highly evolved Protestantism, and I think there's something right about that description. So in other words, even atheism is dependent upon Christendom and Christianity. And I think this is part of the reason why the sort of the history of religion has gone the way it has in the world. But I think we're, some of the thoughts that I've had about sanity and about collective relevance realization and about the fact that all these things get mediated by persons. We're seeing that now I think persons need other persons to mediate the complexity of the world. And so, yeah. And so I think John is trying to select and harvest practices and ideas. I mean, nobody gives more footnotes on YouTube than John. And the fact that he's talking about sort of a Silk Road, and he's talking about, Neoplatonism, Christian Neoplatonism. He's using a lot of these practices, and this is John's project. And I'm a Christian minister. Obviously, I sort of have a dog in this fight, and I think Christianity is the way forward. If I didn't think Christianity was the way forward, I would drop it. But even when I think about that, I think, what would I drop it for? I don't see any competitors that appear superior to me than the Christian faith. Now, of course, Jacob is waiting for me to drop it and become a Jew. Islam, of course, would love me to drop it to become Islamic. Some want me to pivot in Christianity and become Orthodox, yada, yada, yada. I'll change when and if it seems right to me, and I haven't seen anything that seems more right to me than at least the path that I am pursuing. So let's see. Bonus: shortcomings, weaknesses, lacks, insufficiencies. I assume your worldview and knowledge conflicts with John Vervaeke's, JVK, VK, John Vervaeke's, it's only JVV. Just asking about your obvious and so obvious differences that can't be reconciled. Well, again, a lot of them came through in the Thunder Bay conversations. I think spirit is primary and material takes shape after spirit and in service of spirit. I think that's incompatible with a physicalist posture, which says that spirit is emergent from physicalism. I think it's the other way around. That's a basic difference that John and I have. And part of what makes the trio, myself and John and Jonathan, fun is that, so on that metric, Jonathan and I are in agreement, I think, and John is on the other side. Now, in other things, John and I might be in agreement and Jonathan's on the other side. And there might be other things where John and Jonathan are in agreement and I'm on the other side. And so we kind of go around in circles that way. And that's what makes it fun. And we challenge each other. And of course, part of what's also fun is that, in a sense, all three of us not only bring our ideas into the mix, but in some ways our communities. And the different communities are mixing. That's what made Thunder Bay and the German festival just so very much fun, is that all different people have sort of majored in one or the other of us are getting together and talking and sharing notes. And there has been a common vocabulary that has developed, and there's been a sort of a common ethos of how to engage each other that has developed, and there are other conversation partners in the mix here. And I feel just tremendously thankful to God for the opportunities that he's given me in this little corner of the internet. And, for the last couple of days, I've jumped into Jacob's Just Chatting because I had the time. But it's, and doing the Randos conversations with many of you, I just feel thankful to God for my opportunities. And along the lines, I'll continue to critique John's ideas. John will critique mine. Jonathan Peugeot will be in the idea. All of you will be critiquing all of our ideas. Mark Lefevre, he loves to critique, and he's got a YouTube channel called Navigating Patterns that you can subscribe to. And he would love you to subscribe and listen to his videos. He told me he's going to break down the PVK Vouch conversation. That might be the first Navigating Patterns video I sit through and watch the whole thing for. So, this is a lot of fun. And so that's kind of how we feel about each other. And we want to have more opponent processing, but we want to do it in a way that isn't cheap shots and personal insults. And no, we want to do it in a way that's productive. Let's respect people and go really hard at ideas and arguments. That's what's really fun. So, all right, Grim Grizz. Hey, Paul, if the power goes out this winter, should we take someone's vaccination status, faith, into consideration when it comes to sharing our limited supplies? Trippy about that dream, lady. Welcome back. Yeah. He's referring, if you go to the Euro tour, John Van Donk and I, in a hotel room by Heathrow Airport, sat down and for a couple of hours sort of verbally walked through the whole Euro tour. And I shared a dream that a woman told me in the church that I preached in that morning. And that's just a wild thing. That's just a wild thing. She got to church that morning and she looked at me and she realized that she had a dream about me a number of months before, and she had told her mother about the dream. She has dreams regularly. So what y'all are going to make and do with that, that's all going to be up to you. But it was a very interesting thing. So if you're curious about the dream, you'll have to find it in that video. Dennis is being the moderator. Good job, Dennis. Dear Reverend Vanderclay, how did Estuary meetup go last night? Whatever you're comfortable sharing. Estuary meetup went really great. Now, Robert, IRL Politique, he and I did a Randos conversation, and it's in the can, and it'll be coming out soon. I obviously put out a lot of the Thunder Bay videos on my channel, and so that was like 2 videos a day for a while. Depending on how much time I have to put out videos, we'll say it just all depends on what my day job looks like and how much traveling I have to do and all that kind of thing. So some of you commented on how messy my office is because when I work from my work desk where I usually write my sermons and things like that, you can see just how messy this office is. One of the projects I hope to take on in the next couple of months is I am going to rework my office completely. And I am going to try to work a situation where I don't have to have this little corner studio that I'm working from right here and sort of my things over there. I want to have one sort of integrated center where I can do all of this work. And so, I'm building a new computer and I'm buying some monitors and I'm going to have more of these kind of things around. And so there'll be a change coming. And where was I going with this? Oh, yeah, the question. ADHD, distract myself. Meetup last night was great. We had our first meetup since the summer, and I used the Estuary protocol, pure and simple. And we had 13 people. We had some brand new people, and we had some of our old timers, and it was awesome. Now, coming up on Sunday, the 30th, John Van Donk is going to be here, and we're going to do a question and answer and a presentation to my church here at Living Stones. If anybody is in the area and wants to come, we have our church service at 11. The potluck will follow after the church service. So if you want to come, I don't know, bring a bucket of chicken or a salad or a casserole or a flat of soda or something that you can share with the church, and we'll all have a meal together. And then John Van Donk and I are going to do question and answer on that. And I'm thinking maybe I'll have Rick stream it on the channel perhaps. And then I was thinking about doing a meetup after that, but then someone reminded me that evening there's an ordination service from one of our church plants that I'll probably have to go to. So I'm not exactly sure how the schedule will roll out, but once I get that figured out, I'll post it and let everybody know. But no, it was just good to be together, and I do a lot of talking on my channel. I don't actually do much talking at the meetups. I just sort of facilitated the estuary protocol, and I do a lot of listening at the meetups because you get to learn what's going on the ground, and you get to know people, and all of that is super valuable. I get plenty of time to talk when there's nobody else around. So the meetup was really great. And Robert is interested in starting a meetup in New England. And so I put him in touch with some pastors that I know. And when I release the video, I'm sure more of you who are interested in doing some kind of meetup, and then maybe an estuary hub. So an estuary and an estuary hub in New England, because I said, hey, I like to visit my mother and my sister. I'd love to have New England be one of the places that I go to have events. So so more of that to follow. Sherry, Pastor Paul, quick question. Have you kept up with Grail Country or the Job podcast? No, I have not.
Check.
Job's podcast, that's not on YouTube, so I'll have to check my feed on that. I haven't checked that at all, but Nate continues to have there's just so much content being put out by this little corner of the internet. I can't keep track of it all. Between Karen's channel and Grail Country and Grim Grizz and Jacob now, and Chad was doing a lot of stuff for a while, and Randos United. No one can keep up with all the, and of course, John Vervaeke and Jonathan Peugeot and Jordan Peterson and no one can keep up with all this content. Some of you have jobs that mean you have a lot of YouTube. You listen to a lot of YouTube, a lot more than I have a chance to listen to. But some of those, your episode, Sherry, where you did a lot of sharing. I can't remember it right off the head. I listened to about the first half hour of that, and that was really good. Nate had pointed me to another one where someone was sort of deconstructing their Catholicism. That was quite interesting. Of course, Michael Martin's out there, the Sophiologist, so that's interesting. There's just so much interesting stuff out there that I can't listen to it all, and listen to other podcasts that I like, and audiobooks, because I try and balance my YouTube and my podcasts and my audiobooks, because if I just listen to YouTube, I don't sort of get the long perspective like I get on audiobooks. And you can see that kind of ADHD mixture on my channel. But no, there's a ton of Karen Wong stuff that I'm backlogged at too. More conversations between Michael Levin and John Vervaeke. I've also been following Michael Levin and his stuff, and people on Twitter send me a lot of good links to things. Luke, of course, mentioned the Aubrey Marcus, Jonathan Peugeot conversation. I got that from a link that Luke had left in one of the comments. So I'm fed about 10 times more content than I have anywhere near time to process. And how one thing or another sort of gets pushed up the salience hierarchy, I'm sure at some point, for a while I was using a bunch of clips from Grim Grizz, and lately I've been doing a bunch of stuff from Jacob. I'm sure Grail Country is going to get its turn in terms of my salience hierarchy. So you guys keep doing what you're doing, because from what I've seen, Grail country is, it's really top notch. And Nate is, not only an estuary leader up in the Pacific Northwest, but he's inspiring other people to to start their own estuary groups. And Nate is doing great work up there. So keep it up. And I have a daughter in Seattle right now, so I'd love to get up
Paul,
there.
sorry, not you, Paul. That's fine, Paul. My roommate is named Paul, so he
Oh,
turned around. Is Nate leading an estuary in Seattle then?
I think in Olympia. Nate lives in Olympia.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's not far from where I used to live. So
No.
I have no
Well,
idea.
I don't know. You're right up right up in Linden, so
Yeah,
Olympia is sort of the
that's true.
opposite side of the state, but interstates will get you there
Yeah,
quick. But
yeah.
you're down in LA now, so you're connected up to other estuaries down there. So it's fortunate that estuaries are growing. But all right, Christian Golden. Christian won the lottery and got the first Randos conversation back, and that was a great conversation. In relation to 2 Corinthians 5:21, in what sense did sin itself perish when Christ became sin and subsequently died? How might the very existence, nature of sin itself, not just the relationship between man and sin, have changed after Christ became sin and subsequently died? In a lot of ways, Christian, this is something that I've been exploring and thinking about, a la Tom Holland's work. It's clear that Christ, through the church, fundamentally changed the course of the world in an enormous degree. How, in many ways, our moral imaginary in the West, even like it's said many times, atheists critique Christianity using Christian standards. That's an astounding thing. And I think that has the question you have is related to that, where by virtue of, I mean, we so often talk about sin as if it's something you can titrate or measure with a ruler or in a graduate, in a graduated test tube. Sin isn't like that. My men's group is in the book of Revelation now, and so often some of the guys in that men's group, they want to so we were reading Revelation chapter 12, and you have the woman, and she's clothed with the sun, and she's above the moon, and then you have the dragon and the sun, and I think by virtue of our materialist culture, that leads to this allegorization of the symbols. And that's one of the big mistakes you can make with respect to symbolism. And I think this is by virtue of this correspondence theory of truth. Now, I always have to be careful when I try to qualify this correspondence theory of truth, because one aspect of truth is indeed correspondence. And that's not going away. It's a vital aspect of it. It's vitally important, and it doesn't go away. But it's not the only aspect of truth. And so, in a strange way, the woman in Revelation 12 is Eve, and it's Mary, and it's Israel, and it's the church, the bride of Christ. And you could say, well, how could that one woman be four? No, what you don't understand is that, in a sense, all of the stories of Eve and Mary and Israel and the church, the bride of Christ, they're connected to that image, but they're distinct from it, and they're related to it. But sort of that one-to-one correspondence doesn't work with things like that. Even the idea of truth. I mean, the truth could be that this is a lens cap, and that it's a that it's a coaster, so that your sweaty drink doesn't damage the table. Well, is it a lens cap? Well, yeah, it says Sigma right on it. Can it be used as a coaster? Yeah. I guess I could use it as some kind of lip plate too. So symbolism has that quality. And so when you read the book of Revelation and you sort of say, well, this is, if you're Hal Lindsey 1980 countdown to Armageddon, you read all those symbols and you try to put them in a map in the future. And now some of those events might in fact relate to the symbol, but the events probably don't exhaust the symbol, because the symbol is, as Peugeot would say, illuminating patterns and relationships in the world. And so in that way, the woman in Revelation 12 relates to Eve, she relates to Mary, she relates to Israel, she relates to the church. The story relates to all of those things. So that's, and so when you talk about sin, you have to keep that kind of thing in mind. And CRC's been having, see, Richard is asking about it, in CRC Voices, where I write a fair amount, not as much as I used to, but, talking about, we just have this one little word, sin. And, where we can say, let's say committing adultery is a sin. Yes. We are all sinners. Yes. That doesn't mean we're all committing adultery. And you have to understand the flexibility and the nuance of a word like that in order to handle it correctly. Because there's, let's say, murder. Okay. Murderers should be murderers should be punished by the state. True. Murderers are sinners. Yes. We are all sinners. Yes. Therefore, we are all murderers. Murder, read the Heidelberg Catechism, hurting someone's, not defending someone's good name, let's say. Language has that flexibility. And if you sort of become internet literalists with this stuff, you lose it. But there's a deep way in which the work of Christ impacted the sin of the world. And we can point to illustrations of that, but talking about it requires care and nuance. I'll say it that way. Shane, if people have esoteric beliefs, why should we believe anyone when they tell us what they believe? It's some of that same slipperiness of language. Let's think of the esoteric as sort of a mode. There's a way in which reality is so deep and profound, and you can even sort of imagine this via the ideas of combinatorial explosiveness. I cannot, now you've all seen my messy office, I cannot exhaust the complexity of this office in however many years I have left. Just this one little, how big is this room? 15 by 12, maybe? It's one little 15, no, it's not even 15, it's probably 12 by 10. I should measure it one day. I'm going to have to measure it if I get a new carpet in here, because the carpet really needs to be replaced. You don't see the carpet on the video. It's even worse than the rest of the office. But this little room has more in it. In fact, even this little lens cap, I cannot exhaust the complexity of this lens cap in all the rest of my life. But to spend the rest of my life just on the complexity of this lens cap, probably not a good idea. And so in some ways, the esoterics decide that they want to go deeper into the complexity of one little corner of the world. And well, that's their freedom, that's their choice. And when they say something like, this lens cap is such a mystery, you cannot imagine to penetrate it, a la combinatorial explosiveness, you could say, yeah, I get that. This lens cap is a mystery. I don't even know quite how, there's these, when I put it on let's see if I get my face out of the screen here. When it's got a little springs in there or something, so that when I put it on the lens cap, it stays. It's, and the engineering that went into this, the chemical engineering that went into just getting exactly the right qualities of this plastic. This is an amazing thing. If you ever watch the movie The Gods Must Be Crazy, this Coke bottle flies out of the sky and and the Bushmen are like, look at this thing. And everybody in the village is just, you can put water in it. You can, you can use it to sort of mash your food. The little boy can clunk his other little friend on the head with it. And they're fighting over the Coke bottle. And so the Bushman takes the Coke bottle. The gods must be crazy to give us something like this Coke bottle. And he's going to run to the end and throw it off the world to give it back to the gods. So the esoterics have their place. So, yeah, I'm not gonna curse them, but I'm also not gonna spend my entire life on this lens cap. So, and I hope I'm not dismissing them or doing them ill with that. It's just that esotericism tends to focus, and a la combinatorial explosiveness. Even in a lens cap, there's a lot going on there. And so then you have to choose what to pay attention to. Richard, being on Voices with you has been fun, Paul, but it's also been a bit depressing for me. It's sad to be getting such insight into the CRC's slow fracture. I'm going to an Orthodox church now, and I'm considering, very slowly, but still considering, catechesis. Meanwhile, Father Eric exhorts the protesters to come back home. However, you're feeling about how have you been feeling about the church? I'm guessing things haven't changed much for you, but I'm curious to check in. I guess I feel like I'm boarding the ark as the flood waters rise. Well, the church or the Christian Reformed Church, Richard? What's your question about?
Both.
Both. Okay. Both. I was again, I have my little men's group and we're kind of down to 4 of us right now. We're on Zoom and I was reading, so I was reading with them Revelation 12 and the whole book of Revelation. That book is about, so the book starts out with letters to 7 churches in Asia Minor, and they all have their problems. And then as the revelation unfolds, you begin to understand that the seals, the trumpets, the scrolls, plagues are coming. The beast is going to be unleashed. The whore. I mean, the church is gonna have a rough time. And that doesn't just mean the church is going to have a rough time in the 2nd century and the 3rd century. There is a definitive aspect to the book of Revelation. There is a perennial aspect to the book of Revelation. That's sort of the way the day of the Lord works on through history. And the church is always in trouble. And the church, when it's growing wildly and seems to be succeeding, so often it's setting the seeds of its next collapse. And when the church is on the edge of collapse, it seems like it's going to go away and never come back. The Christian Reformed Church started in the middle of the 19th century by some stubborn Dutchman who didn't think that the Reformed Church of America was doing it right. And they followed the lead of Henrik de Kock and Abram Kuyper and the Netherlands, who seceded from the state church because they didn't believe the state church was doing it right. And so they were going to try their hand at doing it right. That's sort of Protestantism's way. And, will the Christian Reformed Church have another 50 years? They just had their 150th celebration in, I think it was 96. No, it wasn't 96, 2006. Yeah, 2006. So, and even figuring out when the Christian Reformed Church started isn't so easy because it's sort of an accumulation of a bunch of things. Will the church get to 2056, the Christian Reformed Church? I don't know. How long I've got 8 years to retirement. Will Living Stones go all the way to my retirement? I don't know. Will I live to see my retirement? I don't know. The Christian Reformed Church has been a wonderful thing. It's given me wonderful things. Last night we were talking at the meetup. We had a bunch of teachers there. A lot of teachers aren't real happy with the way education's going right now. And, I talked about the fact that the Christian Reformed Church, one of the things it did in North America was provide these day schools. And these day schools are struggling in some ways, but in other ways, they're sort of flourishing even more than the church that birthed them. And by virtue of difficulties in public school education. And so the Christian Reformed Church has blessed me immensely. How long will it be here? I don't know. Now, the church, I think Christ, it's the nature of following a leader who is crucified by his enemies. This is the Christian story. This is the Christian story. And so, and part of the blessing of the New Testament is that it's honest about its mess. You have just these amazing things being said of the church in the book of Revelation. And then when you read, it's like I'm preaching through Paul's, 1 Corinthians. That church is an absolute disaster. It's so bad that Paul at one point basically says to them, if you're going to do the Eucharist like this, maybe you should just stop. It's that bad. And so this is the story of the church and the nature of the church. And it's a story of the Christian Reformed Church and the nature of it. And whereas I would love to see the Christian Reformed Church flourish, it might not. But what we've seen throughout the last 2,000 years is the church gets knocked down and it gets up again because it follows its master, who was stripped naked, spread on a cross, mocked and buried, and he rose again. And that's what Chesterton says of the church, and Chesterton was right. Our Lord knows his way out of the grave. And so the Christian Reformed Church, as a small Protestant denomination, is not the church. It's been the church for me. My conversation, I don't know how many of you saw my conversation with Sally Joe. She contacted me and said, the way I sort of left things on my last conversation with you, she was sitting on her lawn in Florida with her Orthodox Study Bible open and realizing she was a Protestant. Well, she moved back to South Dakota and, just by virtue of life circumstance, moved further and further out and then moved to a town of a tiny little fundamentalist Baptist church that had deep roots in her family. And she's been going there. And she says, in some ways I'm home. Does it mean she doesn't have issues with Protestants and art? Yes, she has issues. Would they have issues with her if they were more cognizant of the internet? Could be, but it's her people, it's her church, and that little fundamentalist Baptist church has been church for her. And Christ has reached out to her through that church. And yeah, we can, but that's not pure and they get things wrong, yada, yada, yada. That's right, I get it. But church is the bride of Christ. She's kind of a mess, just like Israel is the bride of the Lord, and she's kind of a mess. Israel is also the daughter. She's kind of a mess. Israel's also the son, and he's kind of a mess. And I'm a child of God, and I'm kind of a mess. So, the righteous will live by faith. And my trust is not in the church's ability to get everything right. My trust is in my Savior's ability to rescue and redeem the lost. That's where my trust is. And the fact that he uses something which at sometimes can be just such an utter failure. I started Will Durant's. I read way too many books at one time. That's why my channel's so ADHD. I started Will Durant's The History of the Reformation. Durant is just such a fun writer, and the audiobooks are good too. And so I really enjoy Durant. And he was going through just the state of the Roman Catholic Church in the 13th, 14th, and 15th century. It's just a mess. I mean, when you look at what happened with the popes and in Italy and in Rome, and in one way it's a mess, but then you also see through that mess all kinds of faithfulness and redemption. The monasteries are a mess, but the monasteries are also full of, really godly, wonderful monks and nuns. And you look at the church and you say the church is a mess, but you kind of work your way through that mess and you start uncovering saints, and they're out there and they're all over the place. They got their problems too, but so it's easy to get discouraged, but don't. And, Richard, you're on your own journey and you've got your own issues, and, you were raised in a little town, and, I met your lovely, wonderful parents. They were a delight. And now you're going to college, and that's a whole new thing. And I'm just going to try not to dox you too bad, but you're pretty open about your story. And now you're, going to an Orthodox church, exploring that.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I literally doxed my whole story on my YouTube channel. So
Yeah. So, and so your story is like that of many, and I see God working in your life. And what he's going to do, I don't know, but I sure know that he brings people through twists and turns. Just look at Paul of Tarsus. Just look at David. Just look at Moses. God weaves the most interesting stories out of some of his favorite people. And yeah, God gets to have favorites. So, so his church, it's not going anywhere. Churches will rise and fall, but his church isn't going anywhere. So, Saint Zacharias. Hey, Paul, I'm reading up on strange and numerous early American spiritualists and denominations. Yeah, there's some interesting stories back there. Some of this was inspired by your usage of Oneida and the Faiths of the Founders books in past videos. Yeah, those are good books. I really enjoyed them. What do you make of all this beautiful and strange heresy here in North America, and how it still influences us in ways that we might not see? Yeah, read about the history of the Mormon Church. Read about the history of the Jehovah's Witnesses. Read American history is, American history that in the North, these were English separatists, and of course the Puritans, one of the more radical, sincere, ardent brand. I mean, they started the Plymouth Bay colony, and then when, of course, the political winds turned in England, then you had more and more Puritans sort of flood the Pilgrims, and of course the Quakers came over, and I mean there were all manner of English dissenters that sort of wound up in the Americas. And of course, down in Virginia, there you've got people that discover tobacco. And wow, you can really sell this stuff worldwide. People love tobacco. And, King James the First thought it was a scourge on the world. And, so, and America got going because of religious motivations and what was essentially a 17th century drug market, which was tobacco. I mean, they if you read, a lot of this is in the book 1493. The colonies in the middle Atlantic colonies like Virginia, they basically tried to, by law, force farmers to grow food because tobacco was just so profitable. Farmers wanted to devote every square inch of land to tobacco production because they were just making so much money off of it. I mean, that's what saved the Virginia colonies. And that's America. And so then, you've got the two great awakenings, you've got the burned over district, you've got the westward expansion where the institutional churches can't go. And so you have this sort of Protestant Bible religion that develops out of it. It's a crazy story. The world is full of crazy stories. It's really cool. Will these people be saved? I never call on me to sit in God's throne and judge between people. I can talk. I mean, even the most conservative professor at my seminary, showed me this. He said, I can express relative degrees of assurance of, and I'm going to reframe it a little bit, because what you're really asking is sort of participation in the next life. And I can express levels of assurance of participation, but never ask me to judge the God's final posture towards others. That makes asking me to presume to know the mind of God. I'm working through that with the vice lists this week of 1 Corinthians 6. And sermons are such tiny little templates. When Paul has these vice lists in 1 Corinthians 5 and 1 Corinthians 6, shoot, did I bring that book with me? Just got a new book on that. It's a really cool book. So obviously, God has a plan for all of this. Can they be blamed for circumstance? Some of the circumstances that we are blameworthy for, and some we just inherit. I'm asking because as a cultural Protestant, I still feel like I haven't found a church or a theology that feels right. And the more I read and learn, the further from Jesus I feel. Well, don't let your reading get out of balance with your communion with the saints. And I know that requires some choosing. Find someone around you that exhibits a degree of saintliness and go with them to church. There are certain figures just in the history of North American spirituality, Peterson being one, I cannot accept will be in hell. Well, why are you judging? You can't sit in God's throne. It is his alone. And if you read Matthew 25, one of the most interesting facets about that passage is neither the sheep or the goats had a full grasp on exactly what they're doing. And that's what you see around you. My advice would be, cry out to Jesus, read your Bible. You're obviously doing some thinking. You want to keep doing that. But faith isn't something that we just think about. Faith is something we practice. And, cry out to Jesus and ask him to guide you and ask him to bring godly, good people in your life that can lead you and help you find the way. We don't get there by ourselves. There are certain figures in North that because he should at least affirm Christ, but if he lives as if God exists, doesn't that count for something? Again, now, I mean, somebody was a little upset that I don't defend Calvinism enough, or at least how I see Calvinism, or at least how I understand the tradition of the church that I have inherited. God is the judge. God does the choosing. My God is large and in charge, not that he removes our agency or our responsibility, but we trust him to save us. And part of that salvation is the working that he does through us with all the twists and turns and ups and downs in our lives and in the church writ large. So don't worry about how God is going to judge others. So we talked about the prologue of the Gospel of John. Let's go to the conclusion of the Gospel of John. They have the disciples are out and they don't catch anything, and they see a fire with fish on it, and it's the Lord. And, then they have a catch of fish and come here and sit down. And of course, Peter had denied Christ, and he's feeling it, and he's feeling the tension in their relationship and the separation. And he's probably acting like nothing had happened because he doesn't want to face it. And Jesus confronts him. Peter, feed my sheep. Do you love me? Do you love me? Peter, do you really love me? And that wounds Peter because he asks him that 3 times. Because, of course, 3 times Peter denied him. And so basically Jesus is saying to Peter, Peter, I see you through and through. I know your weaknesses. The one that said, on this rock I'll build my church, is the same one he says, get behind me, Satan. It's the same one that denied him. What a mess. And then Peter's feeling, on the spot, bad, all those things. And he points a finger at John and says, well, what about him? Well, if I want him to stay alive until I come again, that's up to me. You follow me. You feed my lambs. You do the work. You be faithful. So, as if you don't have enough to worry about for yourself. Cry out to Jesus, trust in him, do your work, and let God worry about sorting out the world. I can't even sort out myself. So if the Trinity is 2 guys and a ghost, and nature is our sister who is our mother, if you read, it's very interesting. If you read Luke 15, the parable of the prodigal son, there's just a father there. And in a sense, the father is both father and mother. And when God creates the man and the woman in his image, that means that both sexes come from the father. Now, I have a mother. You have a mother. We all have mothers. And we're dealing metaphorically here, obviously. So, no, nature is our sister. I like the way Lewis phrases that. And I think, see, if we make nature our mother, in a sense, we demote God as creator. So, but it's metaphor, and I'm not going to push that too hard. Hey, Paul, I'd love to know your thoughts on deliverance ministries, types of deliverance. Yeah, it's interesting stuff. So, for those of you who don't know, so in the Bible, you get all of what has come to be called demon possession. where someone is sort of wholly possessed by a spirit that sort of takes over. In the 80s, I think it was in the 80s, might have even been before, but I became aware of it in the 80s because some CRCs were talking this way, adopting this language. Certain Pentecostals in America kept talking about demonic oppression. And they tried a number of things like, casting out the spirit of cigarette addiction and things like this. I think in some ways there's space for this, similar to what John Vervaeke talks about in terms of the imaginal. The dominant biblical posture with respect to the demonic. I listened to Logos Bible Software, Heiser, the guy who works for them. He had a video on YouTube about demons, and I thought he put it fairly well. And then also the Bible Project. The reason Israel has to get rid of all the mediums is not because there aren't other spiritual forces out there. I'm still wrestling with this book. It's such an interesting book, and I have to do a lot more thinking through this book and the arguments that it makes. But the point of both of those videos that I saw, which I think is exactly right, is that we are really ill-equipped to act like adults in the spiritual realm. And so, it certainly is talked about in terms of principalities and powers, but we're not really adult agents in that world in many ways. And so the admonition is, don't dabble. Now, are there spiritual forces behind human addictions? Sure. If Pentecostal churches were really effective at casting out the spirit of alcoholism on a stage with a prophet with a hand and special music and special words, I think we'd see more success in that front. I've talked to many people who've been that route, and it sort of undercuts the spiritual realities of a program like AA, which has probably been more effective. And I think more effective because sort of what some of that ministry tends to do is become a little Gnostic, because it says, well, the upper register is the only thing that matters, when the lower register matters too. And the tension between them, which is what I think a program like AA focuses on, is, all right, your life has become unmanageable because of alcohol, and you're going to have to take ownership of this. And you're going to have to ask God to deliver you from this. But you're also going to have to work the steps and talk to your sponsor and go to meetings and, and those things too. And even once alcohol itself isn't the kind of problem in your life as it used to be, you're going to discover all sorts of resentments and issues and things that the other 12 steps are really going to be able to help you with. And the community around it is going to be able to help you with. And the tradition is going to be able to help you with. So I'm not going to say that this stuff is foolishness. I don't think it's foolishness, because I think the spiritual world is very real. But as with many cases, from what I've seen, is that sometimes the effectiveness is oversold. And I think the effectiveness is oversold because they're not taking the totality of creation and the totality of our nature within this creation into account. So, can you pray the alcoholism away? I'm sure it's happened. But I think those are often unusual cases, and probably a good 12-step program where, they'll be doing plenty of prayer, maybe not formally, but maybe at home. And but they're also going to be doing some psychological work, and they're going to be doing some changes in people's physical lives. And often, the first steps of detox sometimes involve hospital, to get people off sort of some of the chemical aspects of this. So we are knit together. We are the breath of God and the stuff of earth. And usually an approach that ignores the fact that we are the stuff of earth often falls short. So, Chad the Alcoholic, have you seen Jess P. and Sherry do the entire book of Job? Phenomenal. Something like 22 hours. So Jess P. has no end of appetite to study the book of Job, and Sherry is a wonderful conversation partner. So I'm not at all surprised. It's a wonderful 22 hours. So yeah, lots of stuff on Grail Country, lots of good stuff on Randos United, lots of good stuff on lots of other little channels in this corner of the internet. And one of the coolest things about what has emerged here are these channels. And sometimes I go to those channels and I look in the comments and I see names in their comment section that I used to see in mine, but now they're in somebody else's comment section. And I think that's an awesome thing, because what it means is that the community is maturing. Because I've never wanted this to be about, I've never wanted this to be the PVK show. Yes, Jacob, I have my role. The fun thing is I can talk to Jacob all I want here. And if he wants to talk back, he's going to have to dip into the Bridges of Meaning Discord server. And, well, Jacob's a principled man, so I can troll him from here with a lot of impunity. But I shouldn't do that. I shouldn't troll him. But, yeah, that's a wonderful thing. Kalepa put in a link into a Discord server. I'm not going to click on the link right now. Just finished your video, and I think, okay, end of questions today. We're going to have to drop them. I don't know that I'm going to do this every week. I did it every week for a long time, and there's some times where I felt that every week was a little too much. I want to do it at least once a month. Sometimes more than once a month. I want to vary up the formats. I've been watching, Jacob. I mean, Jacob's done his share of colonizing in me. Jacob has, been lauding the praises of Stream. Oh, shoot, Stream. But it was the little duck. Streamlabs or something. Anyway, and yeah, it's a cool tool. And I've watched how Jacob's used the tool, and there's a lot to that tool. And so I might play around with that tool. I think I want to see more video estuary type conversations. And so maybe another Discord server that enables that, or maybe it'll be in another platform. I don't know. I think I have never wanted centralization. That's just a preference of mine. And I've always wanted much more of a dispersed approach to this. And so when, and so estuaries, I'm not in charge of the estuaries. Now we got a little bit of a certification or credentialing program with John Van Don's ElseNet, but you want to run an estuary group? I mean, I'm very Protestant that way. Start an estuary group. You want to start a little conference, and you want to invite me and Vervaeke and Peugeot or Rupert Sheldrake or Poe the Person or Benjamin Boyce, or whoever you want to invite, do the conference. You're going to have to figure out how to make the metrics work and how to make the money work and all those things. But go for it. And I've loved seeing the initiative of the German festival and of Thunder Bay and of Vendonk in Southern California and others are talking to me about they're wanting to get something going. And so what I like about a decentralized thing is that it's far more durable. I mean, if something would happen to me physically, if my sister dropped at 53 of a heart attack, my father dropped at 77. So, I mean, I poo-poo it sometimes, but I mean, I could die tomorrow, and I don't want this to stop. So I don't want it dependent upon me overly. I want to do my share. I want to do my part, but this can't be the PVK show. So, so it's not going to, Bridges of Meaning Discord as such is going to have to prove its worth as it goes forward. And it's had some challenges lately, and people will say, well, that's your server. It's not really my server. The server belongs to the community. And just like the Christian Reformed Church, it can start and it can end. Just like Living Stones Church, it can start and it can end. But there's a much bigger thing going on here, and that's the important thing. Just finished your last video, accepting the repost of the Vaush discussion. I was curious when, if ever, it's appropriate to make rhetorical points, pointing out hypocrisy, past lies, discourtesy, not debating in good faith. I think it is appropriate. That's data. It's part of it. And a lot of this, so I was looking at, let me make sure I get the text right, lest I lead anyone astray by misspeaking. If you look at, I'll just waiting for logos to open, synchronizing, blah blah blah. It's the first time I've run it on this computer, I think, for a while, so it's taken a little more time than usual. This isn't what I want. Okay. Oh no, I got it wrong. I was afraid of that. The book of Proverbs has a lot to say about mockers and fools. And there are two verses right in a row. Basically, don't answer a fool and answer a fool. And those verses are side by side. So it's very clear that the assemblers of the book of Proverbs knew what they were doing, and that sometimes you should respond and sometimes you shouldn't. Well, I want to rule about when. Well, as John Vervaeke in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, when he talked about rules, a rule-based system can never scale sufficiently because, again, of combinatorial explosiveness. And so rules are helpful guides, but they won't fundamentally answer the question for you. And so it is sometimes appropriate and important. And so, Jacob and I continue to have a lively conversation about is Jesus' way best with respect to this stuff? And that's legitimate because I'm a Christian and he isn't. And even though he likes Jesus, he might not believe I'm getting Jesus right. He might believe that our vision of Jesus is corrupted by Paul and Luke, all that conversation. But Jesus himself could have really sharp words about some of his adversaries. And it's incredibly hard sometimes to really understand how Jesus dealt with the various actors of his culture war. So in the UK, and I posted this video on my channel, I preached this sermon about Luke 18 and 19. And when Jesus comes into Jericho, how he deals with the blind man that cries out because he wants help, and how he deals with the village elders and Zacchaeus. And he eats in the home of a tax collector. And that really offended the village elders because they had in their mind who Jesus should be. And Jesus wasn't going to play their revolutionary game in the way that they thought. Jesus was playing a different revolutionary game. Jesus wasn't looking to liberate Jerusalem and Jericho and the Galilee. Jesus was looking to liberate humanity. And that required him playing the game in a different way. And Jesus' disciples should pay careful attention to him in terms of how to play these culture war games. And we're going to get things wrong. But a lot of this is figuring out how to deal with criticism, how to deal with criticism among and differences among allies. You can see that with Jesus and his engagement with Peter. Who do people say that I am? Some say you're Elijah. Some say you're John the Baptist back from the dead. Who do you say that I am? You're the Messiah, the Son of God. Oh, this must have been revealed to you by the Father, Peter, because you wouldn't know this by yourself. Okay, I'm going to go down to Jerusalem. I'm going to be turned over to the hands of Gentiles, and I'm going to be crucified. Peter, same Peter stands up. I'll never let this happen. Get behind me, Satan. So, and Judas, one of the 12, handpicked by Jesus, sells him for 30 pieces of silver. Again, all of this is built into the story. And when you hear Peterson and Peugeot talk about this as an archetypal story, you can't get outside of it. All of the elements are there in it. But all of those dynamics are with us in trying to figure out how to talk with and about the Nathans of the world or the celebrity atheists. And, Nathan is one guy in Scotland with a little YouTube channel and, just kind of poking at it. And there's other little critics out there, the Debunking the Gurus guys, they're out there. And, there's plenty of people on Twitter and in the comment section and yada, yada. Of course, Peterson's got more visibility, so there's more drama around him, yada, yada. And Peterson does his own thing. But, I've had critiques of Peterson, and, some people are super sensitive. Don't say anything about our Lord Jordan Peterson. He's a man. We're all men. And, one of the most delightful parts of the Muhammad hijab video was, Peterson in many ways expressing his humility, and he can do that very well. And he's, I think in a lot of his more recent videos, he's been doing that better again. And I think Jordan's been navigating some of these things a bit more skillfully as of late than he was, at least for a little while. But we're all people and we all do this. We all stumble and make mistakes. Part of the difficulty of the internet is that we're doing this online and these recordings endure. And so my missteps and my mistakes and my sins and my errors are going to be out there for the world to see. And there have been many times that I thought about particular videos where I've said this or that, and I thought I should take the video down, and I thought, no, I should leave it up. I should leave it up so that you can go ahead and point out my hypocrisies, point out my bad faith conversations, point out my kneecapping, point out the times that I've done wrong. Because maybe if you recognize the times that I've done wrong, maybe you'll learn from it and do better than me. And that would be to my glory. So navigating these differences and these difficult conversations are really important. And in many ways, the more skillful we are at doing it right. Again, I go back to, I'm not going to name him because he doesn't even wear a name tag at our meetups, but some of you know exactly who I'm talking about. The one thing he said to me, he says, Peterson needs to get in more and more fights. And I thought, well, it was after Kathy Newman. Well, he did really well with Kathy Newman. He hasn't always done all that well with all of his fights. Some of his fights, he hasn't fought well at all. He's had some serious missteps, in my opinion. Other times he's done better. He's a human being. And so I'm a Christian. That means Jesus is my master. That means I need to look to Jesus to learn how to live. And not only to Jesus, but to his church. And the church has done well and the church has done poorly. And so one of the hardest things we can do right now is to figure out how to do well engaging people who have significant differences with us. And that's part of the reason that John Vervaeke is such a vital part of this little corner of the internet, because he is different than we are. He is skeptical about the resurrection. He is skeptical about the Christian metaphysical view of the world. He is skeptical about the inspiration of the Bible. He's skeptical about all of these things, but he's very knowledgeable about it, and he's a great conversation partner, and he's fair. What a gift to us such a challenger is to us. What a gift. And our critics are our gifts too, because they sometimes will expose the weaknesses. Now, one of the interesting things, again, in the book of Revelation that I was dealing with in the small group was, again, in chapter 12, the dragon and his angels are thrown down. And why is the choir in heaven so excited about that? Because our accuser, he's the accuser in the book of Job, our accuser has been cast down and no longer, in that sense, sullies our reputation before the throne of God and the one who sits at his right hand. But at the same time, a big part of the job of the Holy Spirit is to convict us of our sin. And so you have all this opponent processing built in. And so our critics, and the book of Proverbs says this, our critics can help us if we can sort of understand what of their criticism are their own insecurities, their own weaknesses, their own lousy behavior, and what of their critiques have validity. And if we can learn from them, if we can be humble enough to learn from them and say, yeah, he's right on that point. He might have been wrong on everything else, but on this he was right. And in that way, he blesses me. That's the posture of the book of Proverbs. So figuring out how to do this dance with our enemies and our adversaries and our allies is really enormously complex. But if we can learn to do this better, how blessed we will be. Are these points of critique worth litigating? Sometimes, sometimes not. You always got to figure out when it's worth litigating and when it isn't. And this is part of the criticism I often get. And in terms of Jonathan Peugeot's conversation with Aubrey Marcus, that's going to be one of the big things that a lot of people look at that and say, Peugeot should have countered these points. Well, that's part of why I reposted the Vaush thing, because I didn't do it perfectly. If I would watch it again, I might think I should have done this differently and that differently. But the truth is that when you're in the midst of a conversation like that, you have very little time to think. And you have to do like in the Lex Fridman conversation with the psychiatrist, with a live conversation with another human being, especially when it's videotaped, especially when there's an audience, and there's an audience, especially when you have, Jonathan Peugeot is a member of a church, and he has a bishop who, in a sense, and a priest who he is responsible to and answerable to. So it's really, really difficult to figure out what to say and what to do live, or at least recorded, for thousands and thousands of people to see. This is a tremendously strange thing. For almost all of us, none of us have had the situation where we are present on a stage on YouTube like we're on the stage here. Very few people, before YouTube sort of opened up the bandwidth, would have had to be responsible for the kind of high-profile presence that we are, in fact, inviting into our lives. This is an enormous thing. So figuring out how to do this well, super hard. Should we have a great deal of grace for one another and understanding and readiness to forgive each other when we do it badly online? Absolutely. Because we're all playing at this. This is all brand new. And I think generally, the general rule is focus on the arguments and not on the person. But, to a lot of the points that Jacob and Mark were making, some people have a pretty consistent history of doing poorly at this. And so there might be some people you decide, I'm not going to have on YouTube. But those are all difficult questions that have to be made one by one, and we'll get a lot of it wrong. thinking about this specifically in how it seems that advertisement and branding can play a role in what is acceptable and what is the actual substance of what's being promoted. Well, there's a whole nother aspect. I just saw on Twitter that some company I had never heard of or brand had decided to cut all relationships with Kanye, and because of his anti-Semitic remarks and some of the other things he said. That's another angle of this. I mean, every video I put up, if it's monetized, YouTube and its little algorithm goes through and decides whether or not this video is safe for advertisers. Now, I have YouTube Premium, so I never see ads, but every now and then when I log on to something that doesn't have an account and I see the kind of ads are up, I'm like, you're protecting these people's reputations? Some pretty sketchy people advertising on YouTube. So, but this calls for levels of wisdom and competence that none of us have. So we're all working at it together. So, even if someone out there that you think is a bad actor, or maybe they are, but this is all really, really hard stuff. And part of the difficulty that we're going to have, and this has been talked about quite a bit, is that, I'm in my late 50s. There was no internet when I was a kid, when I was in my 20s. When you're in your 20s, you do a lot of really foolish stuff. Hopefully by the time of your 30s, you've learned a few things. Maybe you haven't. There are a lot of people who do foolish things all their lives. All of us do some foolish things. So now we've got it all recorded and documented, and it's not going anywhere. This is terrifying. So let's have a little bit of humility, and let's be a little ready to forgive one another. All right. What did Zwingli and Calvin have against liturgy? It seemed like they were very liturgically minded early on, but scraped it for more sermon-based worship. What happened? Boy, that's a big question. I think the move towards, let's say, if you think about all of these different aspects on, let's say, a soundboard, on a mixer, obviously the homiletics got built up. And I think some of that had to do with the printing press. I think that some of that had to do with what was happening in the Protestant Reformation, that at that point there was, especially what happened when the likes of the Enlightenment philosophers came in and just brutalized some of the practices of the Roman Catholic Church that the reformers really addressed hard. There was a lot of stuff in the late medieval church that was seen through new eyes now in the Enlightenment. And we've got that today, and it isn't disconnected from that little rant I just gave about everything recorded. Figuring out representation is super difficult, because the sort of flexibility you have with, let's say, the woman clothed with the sun in Revelation chapter 12 and her relationship to Eve, to Mary, to the church, to Israel, it's super complex. And so when Jordan Peterson, and he got mocked for it on Twitter pretty savagely, when he says, "Do you believe in God?" What do you mean by do? What do you mean by you? What do you mean by believe? What do you mean by God? Now, sure, on one hand, it can be a little bit of a sophisticated dodge. On the other hand, he does have a point. And I think in the Reformation, the reformers were pushing against the degree to which liturgy had an unhealthy relationship with magic. And in some ways, the acid, and perhaps in some cases overreach, of the Protestant Reformation wanted to throw out that baby with the bathwater. Same thing happened with a lot of aspects in the Reformation. In almost every reactive, responsive movement, there's overreach and too much. And sometimes, think about getting sober. For a lot of alcoholics, that means total abstinence from alcohol. some of them for the rest of their lives. For many of us who aren't alcoholics, alcohol isn't a problem. In some ways, the Protestant Reformation was strong medicine for a deep-seated problem that had been addressing the church for centuries, and it needed to be addressed. And the Protestant Reformation went at it hard. Was there overreach? Yes. Was there destruction? Yes. Were there problems with it? Yes. But a lot of the attempts in the previous centuries to address those corruptions weren't strong enough. The Protestant Reformation did. And I love the little part of Father Eric's talk in the conversation on Jacob's channel with Catherine and Eamon, when he went through a list of ways that the Protestant Reformation reformed the Catholic Church. Now we're at a point where, in some ways, some of those things have to sort of be rolled back, because part of the organic nature of the pre-Council of Trent Church is what we're looking for in the re-enchantment that the over-tightening of the Reformation and the Enlightenment meant for the church. And so we're always doing those kinds of recalibrations. So, yeah, and so liturgy is sort of back on the table. Will people treat it magically? Some. Part of the problem is in Protestant churches that it's the sermon is pushed beyond what it can give, just like in some churches, liturgy is pushed beyond what it can give. It's tremendously difficult to get everything right, and on this side of glory, we don't. But hopefully, we can continue with our recalibrations, and we can work towards all of us, Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant, doing better, being more united, and being better followers of Jesus, being a better church. Matt C., what does PVK think about the ongoing criticism by the religious right of Jordan Peterson that he is too abstract, psychological, oriented, etc.? It's like criticizing, I was going to say it's like criticizing the Pope because he's Catholic, but I know there's a lot of Catholics that have concerns about the Pope's Catholicism. Jordan Peterson is a non-church-going psychologist. He's a Jungian. He is who he is. And so many of these criticisms, and I'm sure I've done my share of it, so many of these criticisms blame him for being who he is. And people blame me for being who I am. And it's like, oh, you can blame the cat for being a cat, but I don't know why you spend your time on it. And if you want to list all the ways that a cat isn't a dog, go for it. And that might be really helpful to a child, and saying cats are like this and dogs are like this. That's fine. But to me, it's kind of boring. What goes on in a lot of Protestant churches is it's preaching to the base, trying to reassure the base. And the irony of a lot of Protestantism is that they have their own liturgies that they don't enact in church. A lot of the liturgies creep into the sermon. A lot of Protestant sermons are reinforcing the talking points of Protestantism in a way that continues to, in a liturgical way, using the same psychology of liturgy, reinforces the teachings of the church as it is. And so in that way, even the attempt to get into homiletics sort of just transformed liturgy rather than displacing it, because what I hear in a lot of Protestant preaching is basically liturgy. These are the points that we believe. These are the holy words that we use. And in some ways, some of those homiletics become magic words, These are all the statements that we keep saying generation after generation. And if we all keep saying these statements, then we'll know we're on the right path. That's liturgy. And now it's just in the form of homiletics in a lot of Protestant churches. So yeah, when that Jordan Peterson, he's so psychological. He's a psychologist. That Jordan Peterson, he's always talking about Jung. He's a Jungian. That Jordan Peterson, he doesn't come out and say he believes in Jesus the way we do. He's not a member of your church. Those cats, the way they walk around, the way that tail goes, it's a cat. You can complain about the ways it isn't a dog. I don't spend a lot of time listening to that. I see a cat, I see a dog. Do I wish that if I had a cat, would I wish that sometimes it was more like a dog? Absolutely. If I had a dog, there'd be times that I'd wish it'd be more like a cat. Absolutely. We can all have our wishes. So, yeah, I see a lot of Protestants do that. And I just think, not interesting. Michael M., I probably see more Richard Rowland, the universal. I'll probably see Richard Rowland, the universal history guy, later today. Anything you'd like me to pass on as well? We'll just thank him for his wonderful work. I really should talk to him at some point. I'm a little nervous because the dude's so freaking smart and well read that I'm sure he'll catch me in 1,000 different ignorant errors on my part, but the conversations that he's done with Jonathan have been some of my favorite stuff on Jonathan's channel. I love history, and Richard just strikes me as a wonderful guy with a sincere heart and an honest perspective, and I've really appreciated him, and I'd love to talk to him. The problem with talking to everyone is I don't have time to talk to everyone, and I don't want the channel to be just. I need to leave space for randos. I need to leave space for old randos, some of the OG tribe, because, Sally's saying, I want to give an update. Part of the channel is hosting the stories of a bunch of you. And so, yeah, there's a hierarchy. And it's sort of the way things go. And then there's lots of people I'd love to make new friends with. I'd love to be friends with Richard Rowland and closer friends with Jonathan Peugeot and John Vervaeke. And, I'd love to spend more time with Jordan Peterson and Rick and the people from my meetup and my family and so that's why when we've been there 10,000 years bright shining as the sun, we've no less gaze to sing God's praise than when we first begun. And all our anxiety about whether or not some of these people that aren't right now in the fold, God gets. I guess again, this is, I know I sometimes, just sort of laugh off Jacob's ungenerous words towards Calvinism. Calvin probably wouldn't like the term Calvinism, but my understanding of my tradition is that God gets who he wants. I know some people that makes people, well, what if he doesn't want me? And there's this possible apocryphal story about Augustine where someone said, I'm afraid I'm not elect. And Augustine says, go to a church and get yourself elect. It's so I believe that at the conclusion of all things, God will do what's right. And he knows what's right far better than I do. He will be more fair and more just and more merciful and more demanding. He'll be more all of those things than I can possibly imagine in my small little brain. And so what that means is that the next chapters of the story after my death and after however he lands the plane on this story of this world and this creation and inaugurates creation 2.0, that it'll be bigger and better and we'll go further up and further in, and and then maybe I'll get more of a chance to explore the beauty of what God has built into Richard Rowland and his interest in history and hagiography and all of that stuff, and maybe I'll be smarter and better understand the role that universal history plays, especially in contrast with something like modern history. And I think that my appetite for beauty and for God and for the amazing things that he makes and does will be not only satisfied, but stirred on towards more appetite for him in the age to come. In other words, I don't see my rather ADHD desire to read more books and talk to more people and have more conversations as a bug, but it's a feature that, in fact, God has given me, and he will satisfy and perfect in the age to come. So, yeah, I think that's probably a good place to land the plane. So thank you all for meeting me here on the live stream. Thank you for joining in the Bridges of Meaning Discord. And we'll have Rick end transmission. Then I'm going to walk across the church and sit over there in the little office with Rick and see how much more time he can give me today, or when he has to go back to his day job overlords and do all of the things that they pay him money to do. So, and I'll have to spend some time and get back on the Discord server too. So thank you all.
Hey, Paul?
Yes.
I was just, I don't know if you have anything to say about this, but as you were talking about all these different things, your conversation with Vosh, Peugeot's recent conversation with whatever that guy's name was, who's kind of this more naturalist type of guy. I was just noticing, Aubrey, that it just coincides so much with conversation I've been having with a friend of mine about our fear of folly. Like there's some aspect of living the Christian life of faith that is so obviously foolish. It is, at least in the world's eyes, it is foolish to trust first. It is foolish to assume the best. It is foolish not to protect oneself. It's foolish. And anyway, so I just want to credit you and compliment you and Jonathan Peugeot. I mean, he may not hear this, but there's just something so wonderful about your guys' willingness to engage in this folly that is not even, it's not even in the same category of folly that is, fiercely holding to a position that will later be revealed as foolish. It is a willingness to love when maybe it's not deserved. It's a willingness to take risks and to invest in relationships where you're not going to get any payback. And I'm just so grateful to have examples of that righteous folly that I would love to be considered more foolish in those areas. So thank you.
That's beautiful. That's beautifully said. So thank you. That's very kind. And yeah, I mean, ultimately we're these screens, these beings of light here on the screen. And I hope that we can encourage all of you to, obviously for Jonathan and myself, we want you all to be better disciples of Jesus. In the more secular realm, we want you to be better human beings. And to the degree that we can, while we were still sinners, Paul of Tarsus wrote, Christ died for us. And when you think about the story of the Paul of Tarsus who persecutes the church, Paul, why do you persecute me? Why do you kick against the goads? So yeah, let's loving your enemies is not advanced Christianity. It's hard to do, but it's basic Christianity, and it's part of what we're called to do. So thank you. All right, Rick, go ahead. You can end transmission.